This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Again, we have three speakers. Reilly, who is a veteran of this series.
Yes,
indeed, and served in Tanganyika. Colin has already introduced himself over questions. Served in Kenya, and Chris Cochran, who's also introduced himself in the first session. Whose experience was in the Solomon Islands. So we're going to take the speakers in the order they appear on the program. I've had a special request from someone to say, speakers, please, speakers and questioners, please speak up. The acoustics. This is a beautiful room. The acoustics are brilliant, I'm afraid. So if you could do that, that would be much appreciated. And if people really do have problems hearing, there are kind of spaces closer to the front. If you so it gives me great pleasure to ask Lynn to begin the session.
thank you very much. If you don't mind, I'll remain seated. I've got to the age when I don't enjoy standing up very long. I've stuck more or less to the questions which were posed originally. So the first is, what were the policies towards localization and training? First, in the colonial government, I think the answer probably is not very much. Twining, as we've heard before, reckoned around 25 years before independence. There were very few, as I'm aware of, very few Africans in senior positions. Dunstan Omari, Orba Mani, Abdullah Fundakira, I can't think of many more. So it was pretty sparse, as I think we heard also this morning. Then in 1958, when there was a change of governor, rather I think to Nyereri's surprise, Turnbull came in having realized that there was only one way, and that was towards independence, and said to Nyerere, Mr. Nyerere, I think we have things to do together. And I think things started to move. I had a bit of a row with my PC, provincial secretary, in 1958. And it boiled down to the fact that I said, well, I think it's just ridiculous. We're not training anybody to take over from us. And the long and short of it was he said, right, you might as well start. So I was one of three at the beginning of the administrative training centre at Mzumbe, which as far as my memory goes, started in 1959. What were the post-independence policies? Basically, I think in the mind of Nyerere and some of his staff, despite what we heard from others, and I think, Tim, you're quite right, what Nyerere said in private and what he said publicly may have been two different things. I certainly remember at Mzumbe, where we had a number of speakers coming to talk about politics and government, and we had Oscar Cambona coming up. He was in charge of police. He gave a long speech to the young budding administrative officers about how we cannot get rid of these expatriates. It's absolutely essential. They're here to stay. I have no intention of Africanizing the police. He went back to Dar es Salaam, and the following day he Africanized the police. The district administration wasn't quite as blatant as that, but certainly I think by the end of 1961, when Tanganyika became independent, the writing was very much on the wall, and I think many people like myself felt, well, if you're going to get another job, it's probably best to move now. And I think basically a lot of admin officers left within 2 or 3 years of independence. When and what form did localization take prior to independence? I was fortunate in that in 1958 I was in Gator district, and I think I mentioned in the first session here, the first witness seminar, that there had been a bit of a showdown, partly because the DC was somewhat autocratic, to say the least, but I think partly because there was a great push towards multi-racial local authorities, and this was very strongly resisted, particularly in Gator. And I think the Reilly rather wanted to show things out. So administration broke down in Gator, the DC had to leave. When it was restored, 7 out of the 13 gazetted officers were in fact Africans. And very nice guys. I mean, I worked with these chaps. There was Hamza Aziz, whom I used to go hunting guinea fowl, who became head of the police. Joe Lamata, who spent a year at Trinity Hall, who became the head of the civil service, and one could go on. But it was a slow process. As I mentioned before, the ATC Mzumbe was started in 1959. The budding administrative officers were not highly educated. I don't know in detail because I can't remember the facts, but basically I think they were medical officers, teachers, I think some were agricultural, but I can't remember in detail. Basically school certificate level of education. Very pleasant to work with, hard-working, and very keen to get on. So I must say it was a pleasure. How soon did locals replace the colonial service? Well, as I mentioned, I think in the admin and police it was about 2 years later. In the technical departments, as I think we've already heard this morning, it was very much later. And I certainly have a number of friends who stayed on for a decade or so. Now the interesting thing is to me that unlike Jomo Kenyatta's, we will hear from Colin in a few minutes, who relied very much on the provincial administration, Julius did not. His power base was unquestionably TANU, later the CCM, and it was very soon after Tanzania became, Tanganyika, became a republic in December 1962, that he changed the system and appointed politicians, TANU faithfuls, as district commissioners and provincial commissioners. They changed their name. The districts were called areas. They were pretty much the same geographically. Provinces, there were 9 provinces in 1961, and they were enlarged to 17. The district officers and district commissioners then became administrative secretaries, in theory, but seldom in practice, to advise the politicians on running the districts. I'm sure others will have comments on this, but from what I can make out from my time there and several years doing research afterwards, it was not, shall we say, a great success. Because I don't think that the area commissioners and regional commissioners took a great deal of notice of their advisors and really ran the show as their own kingdoms. When did admin training start and in what form? Well, at ATC Mzumbe, as I said, it started, I think, in late '59. That's only just over a year before independence. And I think the courses, as far as I remember, were 6 months. About 20 officers, 20 students, and there were 3 trainers. I think we heard this morning. We were not trainers. We were district officers and had to learn the job. We did have some, I seem to remember, attending for some reason or other a 3-week course at the HM Treasury here in London. But basically, we made it up. Richard Brain, who was the boss, I think spent a bit of time in Zaria trying to learn what had been done in Nigeria, and I'm not sure, Colin, he may have visited KIA. The programs were very practical indeed. Obviously we did give lectures or talks of some sort, but a great deal of it was sort of case studies, exercises, practical sort of role plays, just trying to get people to understand what a DO had to do. In terms of subjects, law was quite important because, of course, we were, as you know, magistrates. Work with the native authorities, basically, again, local law and how we had to deal with that, and the native treasuries. How to run a boma, the kind of problems that you had to face, the laws you had to understand. We did quite a bit with trying to understand what a district team was about and what development was supposed to be about, and to pass this on. It was, the district teams hadn't been going for that long, I have to admit. And then quite a lot of exercise in how to write and public speaking. In addition to that, there was certain emphasis on physical training, each morning, sort of physical jerks in the quad. And 3 weeks, I think it was 3 weeks, at Loitokitok, at the Outward Bound Mountain School, with the intention of developing leadership skills and teamwork. Wasn't all really popular with most of them. How appropriate to the needs of independent Tanganyika was all this? My own contention, which could be challenged, is that the system, had the system remained much the same, the administrative system, training wouldn't have been too bad. It was fairly practical, it was geared to what a DO did, but as the system did change, it really provided very little. There was a much use. I remember we well trained, I'm hearing about this when I went back after, later to do research, speaking to a chap who had been one of our students. And he was very conscientious, as he was supposed to be. And when the area commissioner was caught filching money from the native treasury, he had him locked up. Well, that was the end of this guy's career. One could go into that in a bit more, I suppose, but I have a feeling that Julius Nyerere was not, really not like Jomo Kenyatta at all, in the sense that he didn't particularly want to see the colonial system continued, at least in terms of administration. What was the influence of technical assistance and training? My guess is that after independence, the influence was quite considerable. It's interesting, I knew quite well the bloke who took over as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Dar es Salaam, Cranford Pratt, a professor from Toronto University, no experience of Tanganyika, and no experience of public administration as such. So the courses, as far as I'm aware, and I remember actually living there for a while, the courses at the university, which more or less took over from Mzumbe, were political science, highly theoretical, and largely lectures. There was a certain amount of training overseas, though this was slow to take off. And again, I think Colin and I, since we both come from IDPM Manchester, which we thought was highly practical, and in the early days it was. We did highly practical courses. The same could be said of InloGov in Birmingham, and places like Swansea, LSE and others also ran rather practical courses initially. But inevitably, the demand for paper qualifications increased, courses became more academic, and I'm not sure but much training, as I would see it, was continued. 10 minutes gone? No, not yet.
Two minutes.
2 minutes more.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Well, what's gone wrong? This isn't so much my witness evidence. I've been in training ever since I left Mzumbe, one way or another. I've started at least half a dozen training institutes around the world. I've learnt, I think, since the ATC Mzumbe days, quite a bit about management training and how it works and why it doesn't and so on and so forth. But I still have the question, why has it not, on the whole, succeeded? As I was mentioning to someone this morning, I have a son who's now in Tanganyika, and I visited him a few weeks ago. He's running a business out there, and his problem is not that the guys, very nice guys, who are the senior blokes working for him, it's not that they don't know their subject. They do. Accountancy, marketing, rearing chickens, as it happens to be, and so on. Problem is that they do not seem to be able to manage. They don't seem to think ahead to what I would call management by walking about and seeing what's gone wrong and paying attention to it. This does not seem to happen. So it's not just that he faces problems which are enormous of theft and corruption, which certainly is an inhibitor in Tanzania at the moment. But it's also this problem of what has gone wrong with management training, not only in Tanzania, but in my experience elsewhere, that it doesn't seem to produce the goods. So I leave that question with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all to say that there was no policy by the British government or the Kenya government prior to 1959. And in 1959 they were still recruiting young men from the UK to join the Kenya Administrative Service. However, as you remember, in 1959 Prime Minister Macmillan in South Africa made his famous Winds of Change speech, and he and Ian MacLeod, the colonial secretary, were not happy about how much the colonies were costing. There had also been pressure from the African elected members in the Kenyan government because they were worried about what they saw as the undue dominance of the European settler community and officials in the government. And so this led to the first Lancaster House Conference in London in January 1960. And of course, it was at this conference where it was established the principle of African majority rule. Within the government, as we heard this morning, but not part of it, Tom and Boyer had taken the initiative to start to get scholarships in American colleges for Kenya Africans, and shortly afterwards Oginga Odinga followed suit by sending young men to the Iron Curtain countries. But of course this caused problems later, which I won't go into, in terms of trying to identify all the people, the men in America, in the Iron Curtain countries and in other parts of the world who we needed to get back to Kenya so that they could take over running the country. In October 1960, Tommy Neal, who was permanent secretary to the chief secretary, he suggested the appointment of an administrative officer, Terence Gavahan, to the newly created post of localization and training officer. And within 6 weeks, he and Fred Altorfer and Joe England had produced the first interim report on localization. And this report set a target of 3,000 Africans to be trained by in the top 10,000 posts by independence. But this they assumed would be 5 years away. In fact, it was 3 years away. Then a 100-page analysis was made of the entire staffing position in the civil service. It was compiled by an executive officer led by a man called Nisar Mir. And this enabled, it was terribly useful because it enabled any department's needs and opportunities to be identified. And of course, Gavahan himself was in an ideal position to oversee all this because he wore two hats. He was the president of the Senior Civil Servants Association and therefore concerned with the displacement and compensation and pensions of expatriate staff who were going to be removed. And as the officer responsible for localization and training, he was responsible for making sure that he produced a timetable to achieve the Africanization that was required. And I quote from what he said later. He said, "It helped for a time that I could usually agree with myself without debate after consultation." The next step, of course, was the training of the African administrative officers for the provinces and for the central ministries. Again, Tommy Neal produced a paper which led to the establishment of the Kenya Institute of Administration, the KIA. And this was at Jean's School, it had been a former CD centre. It was about 68 acres, about 7 miles outside Nairobi. As they say, it had been a training centre called Jean's School for the community development people. And when the first 6-month course for administrative officers began in July 1961, the old dormitories and classrooms still had to be used. So there was a great need for speed and money. The United States government and Syracuse University wanted a significant input of staff to the KIA in return for their dollars. Well, they didn't get a significant input, but they gave us the dollars anyway. And 2 public service engineers, Garland and Graham, produced permanent institute buildings from a blueprint for a European girls' boarding school, which had never been used. So it proved very useful. And the new classrooms and dormitories were ready by 1962, November. The direction of the KIA in its early days was under the acting principal and ex-administrator, Eric Gordon, and he was seconded from the provincial administration, and he recruited me and later Robert Chambers, also from the provincial administration. Shortly after the administrative officers course had started, he founded the executive training department. This was terribly important, especially in terms of training officers to take the place of the Indian Goans who manned executive grades in government, and particularly the key post of district clerk. Equally important, of course, also was the training of stenographers to replace the white women, the Mabibi Wayupe, who had been so significant both out in the district and in the central ministries in Nairobi. They were vital. Work couldn't have continued without them. And so they were trained in 2 colleges which were set up using Swedish finance and some staff. One was in Nairobi and one in Mombasa. Also at the KIA, of course, there was still the Community Development Training Centre, and in late 1962 they also set up a cooperative training department and a local government training department. And finally, in terms of other training, a district officer from the Northern Frontier District called Neville Judge brought down some Somali tribesmen to be trained in the management of local government so that they could go back to man their African district councils in the northern frontier, which up to that time had been manned by officers from other parts of Kenya, because of course the Somali leading a nomadic life, very few of them had very much education. Returning to the training of African officers, African administrative officers that is, the mandate for the Colonial Administrative Service in Kenya from 1923 onwards was of course the Devonshire Declaration. And I quote, this stated that the interests of the African natives must be paramount, and that if and when those interests and the interests of the immigrant races should conflict, the former should prevail. But as Charles Hornsby has pointed out in his book on the history of Kenya, which he published earlier this year, there was little indication in practice of African paramountcy. The government remained dominated by settler opinion. However, the mandate was important to the administrative service, although its implementation sometimes made relationships with the departmental officers, particularly with the European settler community, rather strained. But Africanization of the administrative service didn't only start in the early 1960s. Some African administrative officers had been working with their expatriate colleagues since the late 1940s, when some African assistant district officers had been appointed on the suggestion of a provincial commissioner called Kenneth Hunter. They soon became district assistants, and of course when the Mau Mau emergency made the need for administrative officers even greater, their numbers swelled. So we already had quite a number of African colleagues working with us. And Colin McLean, who had been a district officer himself and later became deputy principal of the Kenya Institute of Administration, in 1975 he wrote, "Our relationships with our African colleagues were generally good, initially because they were one of us, and later because they earned our respect. In our meetings with district commissioners, any unwelcome instructions which came down from the settler-influenced government in Nairobi could be avoided by a variety of means, to which our African colleagues were privy and in which they participated. One or two of these older African officers were amongst the 40 officers trained on the first 6-month courses at the KIA. As Wynne was explaining with his, they were mostly ex-school teachers, headmasters, senior clerks and so on. They didn't have degrees, but their lack of a degree didn't mean they weren't intellectually often very bright. It was just that the custom was as soon as they'd finished their secondary education, they would have to go out to work to earn money to pay the fees of their younger siblings. The syllabus and ethos of the first 2 courses for the administrative officers reflects Eric Gordon's own background and experience and his values. He'd been a lieutenant in the RNBR, and he had degrees in geography and agricultural economics and about 9 years' experience as an administrative officer. He knew that Kenya's first senior administrators would need confidence and self-discipline to carry out their work. He knew that most were likely to receive accelerated promotion when they left, and he knew that in the early days of independence they would have to run the country while their political masters were settling in. And perhaps most importantly, because he and they knew that many eyes would be watching their performance, with some, especially the diehards in the settler community and other expatriates, hoping perhaps that they might fail. These were the main reasons why he had early morning parades, mess dinners, visiting the East African Navy in Mombasa, sailing and pulling whalers, sessions on discipline and authority, and for the 3-week course at the Outward Bound Mountain School at Loitokitop, on the ropes courses, abseiling and climbing the mountain itself. All this was to build an esprit de corps, to give the chaps confidence in themselves and pride in the service that they were working in. Not, as many people misguidedly thought, to toughen them up. Isn't it interesting that not long after this, many organizations, private companies and government departments started sending their staff on expensive outdoor management courses for the same reasons. In the early days, of course, training was mainly in the form of lectures, field work, report writing, memo writing, use of English, finance and management. All these were important for them, especially those who were going to be posted to the central ministries. Law, because they would become ex officio third-class magistrates, and also they'd have to pass the law exam for administrative officers if they wanted to be confirmed in their posts. And they got breadth to the syllabus in terms of economics, politics and sociology. And before independence they received this at the College of Social Studies in Kikuyu, and later on after independence 3 lecturers from Syracuse University, 2 young ones and a very senior one who was very able and very popular, Professor Channing Richardson from the Maxwell Graduate School. But towards the end of 1962, there were 2 valuable innovations to the syllabus brought in by my colleague Robert Chambers. He had been made the director of the number 3 course, and all the people from this course were graduates from Makerere. Perhaps some were referred to earlier, all of them. So the first input of an all-graduate course. But they only had 5 to 7 months experience in the service. So their need was to learn more about government procedures, minute and letter writing, and handling files. So Robert's response to this was to seek help from the Ministry for Constitutional Affairs and Public Administration, which was our KIA parent ministry, headed by Mzee Kenyatta himself. He wanted help from these officers to identify suitable files. Not to write them himself, as I'm sure the ones that Jacobs wrote were as good as you get, but Robert wanted files dealing with the actual subjects. And he got these, and 2 files were identified, and on them he had copied also any comments that had been put on the files as they were being taken through the system. And some of these comments, of course, were from senior officers who were known to the students. Some of the comments were by Mzee himself, and very terse they could be. So this added interest and even excitement as the students read these. What Robert did, each folio was handed out to the officers, and they had to do an individual exercise in decision making. They'd be given the topic, what are you going to do about it? And Robert would mark these overnight and then give them back, and they would be discussed in class the following day. And so on. A second initiative of Robert's was to create what was called the District Development Plan. And what this was dividing the 18-officer course into 2 syndicates. Each one, the officers would role-play senior staff, and they would have to produce a district development. And I can't go into the details of this. I have them if anybody wants to talk about it later. But needless to say, it was very exciting. It included a flight with a Beverley aircraft before they actually did it, flying over the chosen district at 5,000 feet and then at 500 feet, and then a 12-day safari under canvas, going out to meet people in the districts and talk to them, and then later on to visit the ministry to find out actual data about this particular district. In conclusion, what I will say is that in answer to the question, did they emerge as useful administrative officers? Charles Hornsby has written, quote, "They emerged with a belief in law and order as a precondition for development and an ethos of discipline, hard work and public service." And in my opinion, I feel it's a bit of a disgrace when you think of all the awards that were handed out, that neither Eric Gordon or Robert Chambers received any acknowledgement for this real pioneering work that they did and which was so successful. Thank you. Thank you very
much. My talk is of the 15 years I worked in education, training and localisation administration in the Solomon Islands from 1967 to 1982 as an administrative officer. That was an unusual career for an administrator, because you administrators know you get posted about from one place to another. For some reason they left me there. So I saw it all from start to finish, which puts me in an excellent eyewitness position to tell you all about the story now, quickly. I've written it up in an essay, and if you want a copy of it, tell me. And I've digested it down, because it was so long, to 2 digests, which are still yet to keyboard. And if you want a copy of each of those, as well as the essay, let me know and I'll send it to you. Background. The very first seminar in this series gives the background of the Solomon Islands and the Pacific. I'll refer that to you for reading. John Smith's book, which is selling here today, An Island in the Autumn, gives excellent background, as well as terrific pickies. Jim Tedder's book, In the Solomon Islands, from 1952 to 1974. If you haven't got a copy, ask me and I'll sell you one. And Tom Russell, Memoirs, I can get a few copies of that. And finally, Trevor Clark, all written in the 2000s. And each one of them has got an epilogue summing up what this seminar is about and what was the effect of our localisation programme. And to top it off, Professor McIntyre at Canterbury University is about to publish, after many years hard labour, a very important book on the end of British Empire in Oceania. I can't recommend those 5 more strongly to you. I condensed it down, this talk, to about 18 quick headings. First of all, the definition of localisation. I haven't really heard much about that. What we were about, what we were there for. We were there to train and get out and replace as fast as we could to catch up with the political targets that we were given. I said earlier under questions, those political targets were way, way ahead of the education and the localisation targets. So time was against us. It was catch up, and we never caught up, as these books will tell you. Government and politics. It all started in 1962. The Colonial Service asked the Solomon Islands administration, when will the Solomon Islands be ready for independence, economic independence and political independence? And they replied, 1977. On the evidence, I know not what they based that. You know, they could have plucked it out of the air, because what I'm going to tell you next, but that's what they said. And London held them to it. London tied the Solomons down to self-government, 75, independence, 77, regardless of the consequences. Whether there was an education system, whether there was a training system or not. That was a hell of a hand to begin with. And that needs researching a lot more. Now this quickly moves on to education, politics and policy. Educationists amongst you here, I didn't hear any of you say about education for what? Education for jobs or education for the whole person? That was a conflict of interests, vested interests. I wrestled with that for 15 years. Educationists are purists. Localisers are pragmatists. Never squared that circle. But we control the finance strings. So money only went in sufficient amounts to fund what the localisation and training needs were. Next, the public service trainings. Oh, there was a rash of them. All over, you know. What do you do? Different views, different methods. We chose in the end Win Reilly and Colin Fuller from Manchester after 4 years of trial and error. But the various universities kept plugging their products, and really they were really out of touch with what they were meant to be doing. And the best was the Manchester University, and deserved great credit. So we used the best and dropped the rest. Now in education, politics and policy, we had limited funds. So we used selection and guidance, aptitude and selection tests. Can you imagine the reaction from the purists, the human rightists? But we had to do it to fit people into the right career and training, because we hadn't had time to mess about with what people really wanted to do. They had to be trained in what they showed aptitude for and what they had the ability in. We carried on with that right up until independence and soon after. But that was abandoned afterwards, largely because localisation was done. Localisation policy. 1974, a committee was set up, wrote a report recommending a target for every single post in the whole economy. And those targets were set rigidly. And the important thing is this, the quotas. The Solomons and the Pacific Islands are very divided, in the Melanesian states. So it was vital you had a wide and fair distribution between tribe, language and religious faith. Otherwise you would really have no chance of creating a unified state. So the Scholarship Selection Committee, of which I was secretary, made sure there was a fair distribution. But you kept quiet about it. It was thoroughly unofficial. Now the consequence of all this were dirty tricks. And dirty tricks were thoroughly unpleasant. Cutting posts in the establishment to get people who were troublesome. Abuse of the P&P compensation scheme to get rid of people quickly and refuse things. Spinning to undermine authority and credibility. Revenge and payback. Classic example was to close down the expatriate UK-funded education school. That would completely wreck the localisation programme. And physical and verbal abuse. Small community, I came under serious threat and had to have police protection. My wife was verbally and regularly physically abused. After the police protection was withdrawn. My wife's male relatives provided me with the muscle and protection for the rest of my service, which was very effective indeed. Otherwise we wouldn't have got through it. This caused suicides, mental breakdowns, and the worst thing of all, harassment of educated females. Because the one thing that came out of our education training were the females. They were fantastic. But of course the culture was no females in positions of authority, so they did everything possible to keep them out. Fall in morale and damaged reputation and careers. Now, dirty tricks, you'll probably be ashamed to hear about it, but it was done by both islanders and Europeans. And it was done really out of fear of what the unknown and what was coming, but it's a very important factor. It was done for self-interest. Now, changes to organisation, structure and conditions of service. Would you believe the run-up to independence? We had 5 major changes: restructuring, regrading, different conditions of service, you name it, we had it. Very disruptive, very morale setting. Locals, islanders wanted equality. London wouldn't pay for it, so the expatriates got better conditions of service, and lo and behold, smack in the middle of it, London, Treasury driven, cut the overseas pay of the expatriates. That caused a hell of a row, as John Smith can tell you. The files were red hot, made great reads. It was crass and crazy, and any researcher could have a field day. If only we had more time. It was such a rush. Then we had systems, rules, regulations, and methods. We were creating chalk ices using chalk ice systems. Now, you know exactly what I mean by that. We made our replacements mirror images of us using our systems, which was wicked, absolutely wicked. And it was no fit in the Solomons or the island of the way. So it was no surprise after independence, they just chucked them all about, out, away. And it's no use some of you here writing to the press complaining about it. If you want to supervise your standards, your methods of control, you send out your own staff at your own expense. Don't expect chalk ices to be like us. Now, I did say on question time, I'll be quite strong on this. Being married to a Melanesian, you just do not use our foreign ways because they just cannot handle them. Then there were wobblers and wobblers from fear. Governors, chief secretaries, financial secretaries, ministers, they all wobbled because they were scared of the consequences, what London would think, their reputation, for their gongs, medals, Colin mentioned. Those of us involved in localisation and training didn't get the medals because it was so controversial, because we were always fighting and pushing back. But the wobblers were a real threat to localisation and training. Then I lead on to the FCO, the own working model and culture. It was never user-friendly. I found it a pain in the neck. Do you know, they slandered us. They called the Solomon Islands a potty little place. And stupidly, they wrote it down and it got back to the islanders. So there was no surprise when the islanders said, well, we don't want independence on those terms, we'll stay as we are. And the only reason that FCO changed its approach was it wouldn't get rid of this colony. The whole ethos was, and this is I want you to understand, London wanted to get rid of its potty little colonies as quickly as it could, because as said by the previous 2 speakers, it was costing too much. And remember, it was the 70s. God, what a time that was. So the Treasury drove this. For a researcher, if you want to have a good look at the Treasury effect on FCO attitudes and approach, that's a good little project to follow up. And the other thing was they were fed up with being criticised in the UN. Anything to get out of sight, out of mind. Expatriate problems and island problems, both a pain. I got really fed up with managing expatriates. You know, they behaved so badly. They abused their position. They offended morals. They didn't help at all. But I was sympathetic because, as I said earlier, to expect them to be doers as well as trainers was very unfair. Not only on them, but also on their islander replacements. For islanders, they were demanding equal opportunity and conditions. There were a lot of refusings. They just refused the postings and the promotions. Now we're not having that. We're prepared to stay where we are. There was resentment and payback. There was delocalisation, because nobody mentioned this so far. People failed to pass the courses. People failed the in-service on-the-job training. And finally, we had the problem of peer pressure. You're a white black man. You're a chalk ice. Very severe, very tough to survive. I found matchmaking of shadow replacements with the inspectorates probably one of the toughest things I've ever had to do. But it was vital and essential, and I emphasised matchmaking. Now, right in the middle of it, we had the Hong Kong effect. The best of the lay trainers and mentors went to Hong Kong. Left a hell of a gap. What do? Because the replacements hadn't come yet back from Reilly and Fuller's courses or the universities. We had to recruit retraits. Some of you in younger days. Can you imagine the political reaction of that? But they proved vitally important. They had done it before in Tanzania, in Kenya, you name it, they'd done it. And they were our saving grace, really, and I'm forever grateful to them. Now, the summary of localisation. 5 decades. 2 decades to complete it, the 60s and 70s. 15 years to damage it, the 80s and mid-90s, and roughly 8-9 years to destroy it. That's the 2000s up until today. 50 years of investment of time, talent, and money. Was it worth it? Was it a wise investment? Well, we had no choice. Those were the political targets. Politicians, pushed by Treasury, wanted it out. Was it too soon, too fast? Would it have been cheaper to human and financial cost if we'd just been a little bit slower, if those targets had been put back 3 or 4 years, maybe? Been less of a catastrophe that came later. Was it value for money? No, not really, because it all had to be done again. And will it last now, with the rescue mission just about to depart? I doubt it. Because some of you mentioned it, the divisions were so incredibly deep of race, belief, culture, custom, and religion. There was not a fat chance of them getting together and working together. So, the remainder of this decade, I fully expect it to hit the headlines again, and the Australians and others will have to go in and rescue the Solomon Islands. And Papua New Guinea is sort of tottering, and Fiji is tottering, Vanuatu, New Hebrides is tottering. The only one that's doing anything is John Smith's legacy. And he was lucky. They were the same unified culture and race, so it was easier to do that way. And I conclude on that note, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Well, we've had 3 absolutely super presentations, and we've got about 20 minutes, 40 minutes rather, left for questions. So the floor is open. Please, as before, speak up and identify yourselves. So please, who'd like to ask the first question? Yes, please.
I'm David Betts. I was in the Kenyan Ministry of Agriculture before Independence. The question I'd like to raise is the wastage of professional training. Now, those papers my own experience. When I left Kenya, we had 13 professional veterinarians in the Ministry of Agriculture. Nearly all of them had been shot through the system to the very top. Very few had any field experience. And one day I visited one of these provincial veterinary officers, and he showed me his in-tray. And he said, only 10% of what is in there will use my 7 years of veterinary training. The other 90% is all showeries, disputes, claims for allowances, audit queries, preparation of estimates, which I've had no training at all. And so, yeah, that was a sad situation for a young man who'd had 7 years of professional training as a vet. He was dealing with all this administrative claptrap, as he called it, which he'd had no training.
I agree entirely. Absolutely. Professionals struggle to cope and adjust to the realities. You're dead right. And the wastage was awful. And the replacements didn't last. In fact, a lot of them went into politics. So there was erosion.
I think
Couldn't agree more.
I just say the key to that, I think, was in Kenya, where I remember the first district agricultural officer I worked with, a man called Philip Remington, and he had there was an African assistant agricultural officer working with him called Paul Miri, or Paul Thiongo, he later became.
Became the first African director.
That's right, and he asked for Philip Remington to go and be his personal assistant. And I think that's often what particularly the very top professionals need. They need somebody to take the, you know, the 60–70% of the admin stuff so that they can do their really professional stuff. They need that sort of thing.
Agree entirely.
Please.
Thank you, Parmeet Singh, ex-Kenya Civil Service. Mr. Chairman, the framework elaborated by Colin Fuller on administration in Kenya essentially has held, as he has detailed till almost now, though with the current incoming constitutional changes, much of that is going to change. For somebody like me who was in central administration in Nairobi, in a ministry like Ministry of Finance, it was very interesting how, in the post-independence period, as per the framework which was elaborated, the administration held its own in very much the style that administration did before independence. But it had challenges. Economic transition of Kenya in the post-independence period particularly focused on the, perhaps a choice of better word, liquidation of White Highlands and settler influence in the Kenyan economy to a peasant-based economy was held very firmly and very appropriately without any consequences which could have been very severe. The underpinnings of this transition, for those who know Kenya, were very dicey, because much of this transition or the elimination of White Highlands was done for the benefit of the Kikuyu tribe. And the central government, led by Kenyatta, had a supreme interest in making sure that this transition went through smoothly. There are consequences of that now, but during Kenyatta's time, this was indeed the case. Carrying on from that, Kenya went through also a very dicey period. Kenya has been an economy very much on the margins as far as agricultural production and food production is concerned. What I, sitting in the center in the Ministry of Finance, found very, very helpful, as far as very impressive, as far as the administration was concerned, was its intuition on food supply situation of the country, so that within the period that at least I was there, we went through periods of drought, but there never was a food famine. and that essentially can be attributed to the adroitness of the administration in handling food stocks of the country. This was also, from security point of view, a very sensitive period for Kenya, and it is very interesting that the administration in the post-colonial period behaved very much like it would have done in the pre-colonial period, in that there was a very close liaison between the President's office and Ministry of Home Affairs and administration on intelligence and related matters as it used to be during the colonial time. Finally, this organization, the administration, held very much its own in a period when tribal dynamics were very strong and were being played, with which the administration, at least during that particular time, kept out of being aligned by one or the other. Basically, this was due to the fact that the procedures that had been developed during the pre-colonial administration, subsequently reinforced by likes of Robert Chambers, etc., were maintained. Unlike Tanzania, where I believe they went through a radical change to the point of even, by statutory order, burning the files of the administration during the pre-colonial times. Unfortunately, I think this was overextended. The capacity of district administration was overextended, in that the evolution of district development plan and the cadre of district development officers did not quite work out as it should have been. Finally, it's been very interesting I made earlier a comment about hierarchy and elitism, and Colin Fuller referred to the cadre of Goans in district administration, particularly as district clerks. Now, you know, not only just the Goan cadre of district clerks, but even the Africans who had been brought in 48 stood no chance of any progressive promotion in this cadre to the higher cadres, because the standards that had been set for the higher cadre were unduly exaggerated.
No, don't really. It's been said, but just to say, yes, that there was an example, if you like, of Jomo Kenyatta's cleverness, and I don't mean that in a bad way. He managed to maintain the economy after independence. Why? Because he didn't call the white settlers to Nairobi, he went to Nakuru, if you like, the settler capital in the Rift Valley. And he spoke to about 15,000 of them, and he told them, he said, I need you to run the economy, because you are the people who know how to manage big farms financially, you know how to manage the semi-desert areas, to open up lands. And he said, I need you, and if you help me, I will help you. I ensure that I will maintain educational standards and medical standards if I have to continue to bring expatriates for the years to come. And he had the meeting out of his hand, and he did what he said he would do, and it worked.
Jonathan Lawley, DO in Northern Rhodesia, and stayed on for 4.5 years after independence. So I was 4.5 years before and 4.5 years after independence. And I want to try and bring us back to the fact that we are a witness seminar, and I think, for the record, I would like to make 1 or 2 points. What it was really like for we administrative officers, in my case in Northern Rhodesia. There has been a hint here and there of people sort of feeling that it's our role to apologise for the shortcomings of successive British governments. That's not our role. Our role is to describe what it was like, what the realities were on the ground. And we found ourselves at independence very often, we perhaps second stringers, without the support that we previously had, coping with massive expectations on the part of locals who thought they would get instant huge salaries and huge jobs, keeping the show on the road. And for instance, in my district, which I carried on running for a year and a half after independence, you know, the messages coming from the chiefs: where are the district officers? Where's the district commissioner? Why isn't he continuing to tour? And you know, you had to try and keep up the standards and expectations in that way. So life was not easy at all. Second point, we in Northern Rhodesia, around about 1961, we had our first cadets, district officers, about 5 or 6 people, high standard people, no compromises on standards whatsoever. People like Valentine Musikanya, Mark Shona, people who held down very top jobs after the independence period and really did us proud. The new administrators who we were having to cope with on independence and for the period after, they found themselves in districts. They were not keen to be there. They didn't want to be away from Lusaka. So that made for huge difficulties for us. And you know, this is something I think that needs to be on the record, to be how we, as the senior people, had gone at independence. It was us second stringers who kept the show on the road. In retrospect, Mr. Chairman, in Zambia, I think they made mistakes, massive mistakes. In a way, the way I see it, they had to make those mistakes to learn for themselves. You know, why should they take it off from us? They made their own mistakes. We'd given them a pretty good base on the important things that they held to be important. And I think that the proof of the pudding now is in the case of Zambia, which is a country which is very stable, democratic, doing very well, and very, very well disposed to the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much. Please.
John Smith, Nigeria and the Western Pacific, and I spent some 5 years in Nigeria in training. I would like to follow on from what Jonathan Lawley has said by putting all of this into a slightly broader context, which might enable us to have a little less of the self-flagellation. We're talking essentially about colonies in Africa and the Pacific. India, obviously, the Indian Empire and the West Indies are in a very different category because they had a much longer period. But in Africa and the Pacific, we were there on the whole for under 100 years. I think that's important to remember, especially when you consider that it was 900 years after the Norman Conquest before we had universal primary education in England, or a university system that was easy of access, certainly in England. When I went to primary school, the school leaving age was 14. When I went from secondary school, came from secondary school to this university in 1945, I think I'm right in saying it was only 7% of people with secondary education who got into universities. Colin Fuller has mentioned the Outward Bound School, and remember, long before it was being used in this country, Outward Bound was created in the Cameroons in the 1940s. And the Institute of Administration in Zaria, which became the model for others all round the world, was opened in 1954. That's almost a decade before Fulton and Sunninghill Civil Service College. So in many ways, our record wasn't all that bad. And I would be the first to claim that we could have got going much earlier on education, but I'd like to suggest there were two particular problems with this. The first was by the time we were really getting into things after World War II, the idea of universal primary education was pretty standard. And to try and commit a country to universal primary education, what a lot of African politicians wanted and expected, inevitably slowed down the whole process of education. Because if you put your resources there, you don't have the resources at the other end. And indeed, you can't have universal primary education until you've got a reasonable number of teachers and so on and so forth. So investment in primary education brings a result in terms of professional people some 20 years later, in the case of a doctor, for example. So you really needed to invest in an elite very quickly, and on the whole, we didn't do that. And the other problem that I certainly came across, and I spent 2 years in training administrative officers, mainly, as we've heard from others, who have been headmasters and so on and so forth. None of them graduates, or very rarely there might be an Indian graduate from Calcutta or somewhere like that. But on the whole, they were not graduates. I spent a couple of years, we had 5 years of that in northern Nigeria, and they became the people that really bore the burden of the transition when expatriates left. We stopped the courses after 5 years because graduates were coming on stream. I then proposed that we try and enable some of our people who had had several years' experience in administration, who were mature men, should gain some form of mature entry into the university and not have to undergo a full 3-year graduate program, but get a degree in perhaps 2 years. That caused riots in Amadou Bello University and was dropped. And those unfortunate chaps, although many of them did extremely well, had to go to the States or come to this country if they wanted to further their education, which was a great shame. So I think these sort of expectations really did hamper some of the things we might have achieved.
David, you also.
I just wanted to record one little piece that I think illustrates the difference of the attitude towards localization of the provincial administration between Tanganyika and Kenya and Zambia and Northern Rhodesia, as you've heard. Tanganyika became independent, as you know, in December 1961. I personally went on leave in January 1961, and I had been told I was going to get married in April. When you come back in June, you will be posted as a district officer to the Northern Province. In other words, everything was going on exactly as before. That would be my next career posting, and that was what I expected. When I arrived back in Mombasa from my European leave, I received a telegram saying your posting to the Northern Province has been cancelled. You will proceed immediately to the Secretariat in Dar es Salaam. And the basis for that was, I think, that when I left early in 1961, the view was the provincial administration will continue as before, and the trainees will come and take their place in due time. And then someone said, but independence is coming within months. The people are not aware of what is going to happen. They will see the same old bonus in the bonus as before. This is unrealistic. They must realize that it's going to be their own people who will be administering. Bring all the expatriates, as you can, into the capital and send the local people out to the districts so that they will be seen to be running things. And that happens within months. And I think typifies the sudden change, a realization of the need to display localization, whether the training was complete or not.
Thank you very much. I've got a little question which maybe the panelists could each respond to. It came out of what Wynne said, and also I think it was echoed in what Chris said. The idea that the training was perfectly adequate for the job as it stood to become a district officer, But in a sense, the nature of course, the nature of administration and politics changed at independence. Sure. And could you expand a little bit?
I'm not sure I can. I mean, it did change, and I think it changed very much from what David just said, that there was a strong feeling that we want our people in the job. But I think that our people didn't mean, my interpretation would have been the people we were training, but they would be politicians who were members of TANU and had the backing of the local populace. I mean, TANU was very strong at the point of independence. I think I can't remember the dates of the last election, only one person from Tanganyika was not a TANU member in the new parliament. So I think that that's really the sum of it. I don't know that I can expand to any advantage.
Well, in Kenya, the job didn't change at all.
No.
Our biggest joy was to get out on safari amongst the people, trying to find out what the development needs were and doing some development. And so it remained the same, and Jomo, as the boss of the administration, made it possible. He gave them even more power, and he protected them against the politicians. There was one case where an assistant minister in the Department of Agriculture, I think it was, he wanted a feeder road to go a particular way around a mountain, whereas the plan said he should have gone the other side. He obviously wanted it because he had a farm which he would pass. And the permanent secretary, I believe, I don't know who it was at the time, apparently said to him, I don't think I can do that. That's not what the plan says. And he said, well, I'll report you to Mzumbe. He said, that's your privilege, sir. And he did report him, and he got moved. Mzumbe supported the admin officer, which is what he always did.
Yeah.
It definitely did change. The district administration, the administrative code changed because it was made open to the professionals as well, so they could do all the admin as well. But also, provincial government, devolution to provincial government, DOs, DCs overnight, and they became clerks to the provincial governments, taking orders from provincial politicians. So they didn't go on tour, and it was expected that the politicians, not the districts, would do the legwork, which is very right. So there was a major change, and I think that's very, very important. I'd answer Jonathan Morley. Yes, dead right. It was much more fun after I left. Which that just sums it up. It was a harassing time. And now, on reflection, we have gratitude at the time, heritage, and we're not doing it by choice. But I think another point which Logan said, it was Jonathan in the Pacific, a close copy of Out of Africa, except for a close copy of Out of Africa, except for on a smaller canvas and a smaller scale. The same problem.
Were you saying it was more fun after independence? Because it was great fun after independence as well.
It was.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
It was wonderful. And we got on bloody well with the people, I think.
Yes.
Especially if you spoke their language and really identified with it.
Yeah. And the key point, which I forgot to mention, they were only interested in localising the 30 top votes. They couldn't care about the rest, because their reaction was, well, we could sit back and let you the expatriates get on with it. But London had other ideas through the supplementation scheme and would limit the number of expatriates could be used. But I don't know whether you found that, Jonathan. Once the key posts were localised, there really wasn't the same sort of pressure.
No, and we got some, we varied, we had some super people, you know, like Godwin Mutali, Philip Bocock will remember, in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. These chaps had been mere clerks, but they'd had a very good grounding, And boy, they coped incredibly well. It's, you know, yeah, it did take the pressure. It certainly did take the pressure off. Question.
Going back to the issue of the relevance of training, I was...
You speak up.
Sorry, Das Plain, Northern Rhodesia, Mzumbe. I was involved, called to a meeting in I think it was the second half of 1962, with the then Commissioner for Community Development, with the future First President of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, and the future Minister of Education, John Marakathwe. And this was about a plan which the government had conceived to set up and establish an outward bound school. And the prime reason was that there was a recognition that whatever training one gave for specific roles, one of our major problems was the fact that we had 73 different languages, and after independence, people who spoke Lozic or Tonga were going to have to work with people who spoke Tivenda and Nyanja and would not be able to communicate other than by using a common language, that they had to learn to trust each other. That outward bound was provided an experience and challenge where people had to learn to work together, both on an intertribal basis and on an integration basis. And so the school was set up, and most of the government and private mining company programs were aimed at training the future post-independence leaders. Part of those courses was to send people on outward bound training, as we did with the Tokatok. And that helped, I think. It was a very necessary thing to do. How much contribution made in the end, I don't know, except that certainly in the first 10 years, most of the people I had through my hands did end up in very significant senior positions in the Zambian government.
Thank you.
That was one positive contribution.
That's a very key point.
Yes. I'd really like to go back to this, the question I asked, that I didn't get much response from, is to why is administrative training, management training, apparently not being very successful? At least that's my hypothesis. As David knows only too well, because he was in the Gambia at the same time, I set up a management development institute in the Gambia. And my boss was the head of the civil service. He asked at one stage, he said, look, I'd like you to devise a course for my brightest young administrative officers. Oh, absolutely marvellous. So with my colleagues we set to, and we did the kind of thing that Colin mentioned that Robert Chambers got going. Something highly practical, sending them out to do a survey or for a project and so on and so forth, getting them to come back, tell us what they've done, let's work it out together whether this works or not. In other words, trying to get them to do something. You could bring in some theory as you did this, but basically it was not a theoretical course. It was highly, highly practical with the intention of getting people to think for themselves, to challenge. Well, you can imagine how that went down with the head of the civil service. Absolutely scrapped it. He wanted nice regular courses, you know, on the hierarchy of needs and all this sort of stuff. Because to do the sort of thing that we were proposing would challenge. You would be producing people who would challenge the elite. And I think a lot of the problem with administrative training is the elite do not want to be challenged. They don't want people to think. How do you react? Please.
Don Barton, Tanganyika. I'd just like to endorse what Wim has just said. preface by the observation that I can't think that in many, or indeed any of the courses that I've ever been on, have ever served any useful purpose at all. It tends to be more junior people who are sent on courses, and if when they get back, their boss in effect says, right, well, you can forget everything you learned on that course, you do what I say, you might as well not have gone on the course in the first place.
I have incidentally written this up in a thing called the Hombe thesis. This was because somebody wrote to Henry Oliver, MBE, as dear Mr. Hombe, and he was the one that really said to me, he was a district officer in Gambia, he said, you're just wasting your time here trying to teach management. Because these guys, they manage, they know how to manage, they've got the little antennae like this, and they manage it to their own advantage. And he went on in this way. Well, it prompted me to write a little thesis, and I put a summary of that available on the side there. Thank you. Please.
Bill Clarence, Uganda. I'll just come back on the point you made that you wondered whether the training was what that.
Oh, could you speak just from the government?
Yeah.
Sorry at the back.
What Win was saying earlier on was we wondered if the training that we gave was suitable for what was coming. Well, it makes me think of Uganda, which had the two admirable first district officers who were on the same training course, the Devonshire course with us at Oxford. Now, what happened to them? The first one was John Kadoha was dismissed by the Prime Minister. He didn't like him, probably because he was too honest. The second one, Frank Kalamuza, who was the head of the civil service, was killed by Amin. The point I'm trying to make is that they were being raised in the very best British traditions, but they suffered appallingly. They probably, I think I agree with what you said, they had doubts that training can be given, very good training can be given in the changing circumstances.
Thank you.
It's the Chogois argument again. It's the peer pressure. Here in the Pacific, the same problem. They were either killed or removed. They didn't want it in our image.
A couple more questions.
Few points. Quite a few of the district commissioners in Uganda, sorry, not running Uganda administration, quite a few of the district commissioners, African district commissioners, had been interpreters and had been gone out with the district officer and had solved the way in which things happen. But two other things here. Firstly, I think that some of the African district officers were under the kind of pressure which none of us personally had. There's a sad story of a promising young African district officer in West Nile district, whose uncle said to him, "You've got a good job, you could guarantee my payments on this Mercedes." He foolishly guaranteed the payments on the Mercedes. The uncle didn't pay up the payments, and the young man was made bankrupt. Now that sort of family pressure is something which didn't happen to us. The other, just to follow Bill, it wasn't only Frank Kalamuza who was killed by our means orders, but my successor as District Commissioner of Chile, Charles Bofafumbi, was murdered on a means office. Even if we got everything right in Uganda, the discontinuation caused by the Armenian years would have thrown it all away.
Thank you very much. Some questions?
Gilbert Allen, Uganda, and 3 years at the Institute of Administration in Nigeria. I wonder if other people ever suffered the problem I had, where I was in the Secretariat and said And I had a very ambitious minister and permanent secretary, and they were determined that nothing should go wrong in their ministry. And therefore, when African was appointed, and two Africans were appointed, they were never allowed to do anything that might possibly cause problems. And I grumbled so much about this that I was sent out to the district, which was supposed to be a punishment, but I was delighted. But I wonder if other people ever had that problem, that these were the British officers who were, I think, so concerned about their own ambitions that they were prepared to sacrifice the property of those underneath us.
Don't know of any instances like that in Kenya.
Yes, okay. Wobbles and wobblers, I call them. And we were exiled. It had a serious consequence for education, training and localisation. They were concerned for their reputation, their self-image, and they were concerned for their medals. I know that sounds cynical, but they do anything not to lift the vote. Any troublemakers out of the way. So yes, I think it's probably a bigger membership of that club than many would admit.
On that note, we've reached 3:30. We're going to break for coffee next door. I'd just like to say, by way of reassurance, that outward bound management courses have never made it to the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, nor were they ever under the current regime. This has been an absolutely excellent session with three wonderful presentations and very stimulating questions. So let's thank all our speakers.